So while people are coming up, so we heard a lot of interesting things about what universities do, that universities are being asked to produce more engineering graduates, more innovation, being asked to provide more social equity in a variety of dimensions and how difficult that is. The way universities are in efforts both to expand their global reach and also to maybe make money, have been making agreements with other universities and countries to try to expand what they do. That could lead to possibilities of threats to academic freedom. And so I think we have a lot of issues here about what's the role of the university in the modern nation state, and how compromised do universities get with some of the tasks they have to take on, especially in an era when funding for universities seems to be declining. So we've got people with microphones, I assume, who can run around, and somebody raise their hand with a great question, please. Yes, down here. So, and please use the microphone because we need to record this.
All right. The fact that I'm the first one. My name's Wilhelm Kroll from the German Volkswagen Foundation, and I've also been involved in higher education policy issues in Singapore and several other places. First of all, I would like to thank all four of you for very informative presentations. And of course, there was such a wide array of different topics already alluded to that I would just focus on one, and that has to do with equity and, let's say, social inequality. I think what I would like to add is really a word which is called path dependency. I think, Saleem, you alluded to the South African situation, and I still remember when I was advising the South African government in the late 1990s that there was this talk about formerly disadvantaged institutions, and I always said, well, they are still disadvantaged and at a disadvantage also with respect to recruiting students. So how can we actually accommodate for that? And with respect to Chile, I was wondering if you look at aspects of social inequality, why didn't you start earlier? Even for Germany, the figures are pretty clear. It starts with kindergarten and with the preschool and prep school and what have you. So the question is how to link these two and how to really look into where was the ground laid more or less for not being able to access the higher education institutions and universities. And also with respect to the outcome later on, I think that's also quite pertinent to look into success rates at universities from people with a socially disadvantaged background. And there we have the same kind of thing, that there is nobody to coach them, nobody to actually support them. So that may even apply to the engineering side of things. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Who wants to start?
So if I may just... So I think this connects nicely with the theme of populism, nationalism, student movements. Because my sense, there are not many people who are going to take to the streets on behalf of 3-year-old children. And I think that's part of the problem. Whereas the moment you get 300,000 students protesting, the most populist responses start to emerge, and we see it in South Africa, where the current president, in a way of keeping in power, is talking about a disastrous policy of free higher education for all in the most unequal society on earth. What a wonderful subsidy for the rich and the middle classes in South Africa. So I'm absolutely with you that I think if we were going to find an extra 40 billion rands, which I don't think we have, I would put it into early childhood education. Because if you start to fix those levels and you start fixing schooling, and we spend an enormous amount on schooling, we'll perhaps have less problems. So it's about the ability to have a generation of politicians who are prepared to think 25 years, rather than just think 5 years and about their election in 5 years' time. I suspect this is a problem in every society.
Politicians are myopic.
Right. So who's prepared to have this long-term vision when it comes to higher education, to science and technology? And in fact, the environment is less conducive for that because of the growth of this kind of authoritarian nationalist populism all over the place. South Africa, Turkey, and elsewhere. United States too. So absolutely. I mean, how do you shift the compass in a sense to say, what is it that we have to really fix in our society? Otherwise, in 25 years' time, we will still be talking about access and admissions and leveling the playing fields and so on, when we know it starts earlier. Of course, we can also talk about nutrition, you know, about creating real conditions for kids from working class and rural poor families
For years and years.
through something called nutrition.
Veronica?
Yeah, I think it's related to the point. We've had a lot of discussion about free tuition in our country too, right? And we've actually implemented it for the last 2 years, even though access had actually increased significantly even before that. Thanks, in my view, to significant investment in financial aid and also significant increase growth of the private sector. So there are changes in the policies during the last 20 years that people have actually not taken well. I mean, the increase in debts, as it's happened in the US as well, and the low quality of some of these new institutions that came about with private sector's growth had a huge effect on people satisfaction with the system, and therefore, led to this uproar and number of students on the streets. A lot of the funding then, therefore, in the last 3-4 years being spent on free tuition rather than on earlier years in education. Not to say that there hasn't been attempts to do things in earlier years, but I do agree that policy is sort of put funding in not necessarily the most urgent aspect, but there are reasonable arguments sort of explaining students' dissatisfaction as well. So I think some of that it's worth looking at. In the case of the institutional programs implemented in Chile in the last 10 years, one of the findings from our work is that there's been very little done in these very prestigious, very selective, most traditional 3 institutions in the country regarding persistence and graduation. So there's been initiatives towards access. We are concerned about that, but there is very little going on within the classroom even to change pedagogies and practices to include everybody and do more to ensure that everyone's learning and that they can actually get through their program to graduation. We have a significant issue of dropouts in our country and non-completion as well. So,
Another question? You have something to say?
I agree with you that the populist way of looking at education would look at the older people, let's say young adults, because they vote. But there's also some real behind it. I mean, in all of the more unequal countries like Brazil and South Africa and others, is that the return of higher education is very high for the graduate. Sure. It's very high. So even though we may say that, well, the politician is not doing something that's out of the actual situation. They are looking, they know what's happening, and they go for what they see as next election's big issue. So I don't know if you can say that that's a populist thing or if it's just traditional politics. So the difficulty is to get the politicians to deal with in Brazil would be high school sector more than very basic education. It's doing much better in all aspects, enrollment and graduation from the first 2 levels. And then high school is a big problem, but it's also related to other themes like violence, urban situation in the slums in Brazil, where crime is very attractive to people that when they turn 15, 16. So it's not so easy as just related to education by itself, but education could play a much bigger role. There is a study done in Brazil recently that shows how much violence for teenagers is related to high school dropout rates. This is like a linear relation. The state, and it's a big variation, like in São Paulo, my state, we get like 10 killings per 100,000 people, which is not too far from developed countries. And then you get states where it's like 60, 70. And the Brazilian average is 30, which is Rio's rate, which is always in the news about violence. But then you look at dropout rates, follow those percentages, those rates. So it's a much larger issue of relation between urban situation and inequality within the large urban areas and how other relate. So you have to be careful. It's not exactly a populist thing. It's related to various things. It's not so easy to understand. It's more complicated.
Let's go to another question. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'm Robin Marsh from the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues here at UC Berkeley, and this is for Professor Pedrosa. I'm interested in your comments on the Science Without Borders, the Ciencias Sem Fronteiras program, because it was government, it was a nationalist program. It was interesting in that it was a one-year program, so students would be connected with their Brazilian universities, but they would have the international exposure, and it was focused on engineering, which was part of your topic, or science, I believe.
Science.
Okay. So I've heard good things, that it sort of fell apart when you were having troubles in Brazil and troubles with funding and so forth. But overall, how would you assess that program?
Well, very quickly. It was a large program, sending 100,000 students, undergraduate students, a few more graduate abroad to study for either 6 months to 1 year, and it was funded fully by Brazilian government. There were issues like the home institution wouldn't have any saying. So my institute, for example, wanted students to go to certain places, but they could choose through the system to go anywhere. And so some people came to community colleges. They were engineering students in Brazil, and then they came. But overall, I must say that the experience was very valid for the students. It's not so clear as the return to the investment, which was around $3 billion, which for Brazil is a lot of money. And it was most diverted from funds from research. It was not new money. It was diverted from the National Fund to support R&D in industry. So in Brazil, it's a mixed feeling about this. It would be interesting. I think it was done on a larger scale than it should have been on a too short a period. It had political and maybe populist overtones as well, and was part of overall support for higher education and undergraduate higher education mostly. And so it's not, it stopped because lack of funds, and the community starts looking at that and say, well, where is this going? So there are studies going on now about the impact of that. Not clear yet how that will turn to be, but and I think something like that may come back in the future. There was this overall thing of competing with China that had all these programs sending people abroad, and Brazil thought, well, we are a BRIC country, so we have to do something similar. It was done in a very hasty way, and probably without much concern about what quality of impact of that.
Great, thank you. Another question?
So, yeah, related to branch campuses and their, academic freedom, and also the issue of money. Let's never mind that there seems to be a lot of money being spent by governments to bring in branch campuses. Can we weigh or look at this conundrum and say it's worth it for institutions to go in and perhaps compromise their normal patterns of or assumptions on academic freedom because there are certain benefits that are provided to the host country? And I think this is the conundrum that, say, at Berkeley is looked at versus, and as you noted, a few other institutions versus others. And there is a interesting pattern in that most of these institutions creating branch campuses are private institutions in the U.S. at least. But is it worth it? In other words, should institutions compromise their normal assumptions of academic freedom because it has other kinds of benefits? And I raise that to Grace, but also to the panel generally.
Okay. Well, I think it is worth pursuing the international branch campuses. Change always takes time, and we are observing changes. Looking at Singapore, for example. Singapore is a very young country, city-state. Economy has liberalized, and they have the intentions to liberalize education as well. It is them inviting the US to establish liberal arts colleges. It is not US imposing upon Singapore the idea of a liberal arts college. So we have to be really determined to give it time to see the changes. Persistence is important. Continuity in what we do is important. Otherwise, if we give up already, we won't be able to see the change that these countries are putting on paper and saying that they want to see the changes. So yes, it is worthwhile continuing to do this because of the changes that are already being observed in Singapore in particular. I don't know about Abu Dhabi or other parts in the Persian Gulf, but yes, in Singapore it is well worth it. In Asia, it is well worth it.
Anybody else have anything to add to that?
So I would just add, John, whether these are being looked at as models or interesting experiments. So I spent a wonderful 3 days in Abu Dhabi last year, invited by Lisa Anderson, who was at American University of Cairo, looking at liberal arts education in Abu Dhabi. And I was struck by one of those quotes about academic freedom in the classroom. I've never always understood academic freedom to be limited to the classroom. I understand it as a much wider, gift of society to us. And so it was a fascinating 3 days because here you're working with faculty from NYU. We know since that seminar, one department at NYU has refused to take part any longer in NYU. And I think we must be honest that there are compromises being made here. And so what is it that you want to emphasize? Is this a possible model for the future? Or is this an interesting experiment with all kinds of messy compromises that go and so on? Myself, I'm not sure it's a model. I think these are interesting experiments.
Grace, did I understand you to say that you thought that these experiments could change in countries like Singapore will become more willing to entertain academic freedom? Is that the hope here?
That is my understanding from the progresses in Singapore. But any country will experience this change to the extent they want to change. We cannot impose upon anyone any change. They will change to the extent they want to change. Yes, they are changing. My son is a professor in Singapore, and when he first went to Singapore, the students had only student numbers as email addresses. And these faculty members from the US were able to convince the administration that no, these are people, we cannot address them with numbers, they have to have their names on the emails. So that was changed to start with. Secondly, students were very respectful, far too respectful towards their professors, not raising any ideas. They were saying, dear respected professor, etc. Now they are saying, hi Grace, etc. So really they are changing. They are changing, but they will change to the extent they want to change. In terms of research, no boundaries. Research, as MIT says, it is perfect for them to do the research over there. But for the academic freedom, yes, time is needed. More time is needed.
So we're getting near the end. There were some people back there who had questions. Oh, got one of them. Okay.
Margaret Heisel from CSHE. I had a question about going back to the topic of higher education and social mobility. I worked for the University of California for a number of years on these programs, and the U.S. has invested heavily in programs that employ the baccalaureate as a means of social mobility. Now there is much more interest, I think, I see developing in new programs in technical education as a sort of secondary step. And I know that Germany has had apprenticeships. I'm curious if other nations are looking at technical education as a sort of medium-term means rather than focusing primarily on baccalaureate education. And I guess I'd be really interested in hearing from Wilhelm also on that subject. Thank you.
Who wants to start?
Well, quickly. In fact, I have a paper in the series on the technical colleges in the state of São Paulo, which have expanded very fast in the last 15 to 20 years. Now they are almost at the same level of enrollment as the universities, and they are focused on technical education, 3-year programs. And overall in Brazil, even the private system now is engaging in technical higher education. About 1 million students enrolled in those programs out of the 8 million total. So it's not like in some countries, which is the majority, but we didn't have much of that 20 years ago. And there are studies in the case of the state of São Paulo that employability and even wages are very competitive compared to bachelor's degrees, especially in some areas like technical people in health, technical people in information sciences, technical people in agriculture, and even in services like catering and so on. So it's a growing part of the Brazilian system, and I think politicians understand that it's easier and different, and there's still some problems with validate that with the academic community as one expect, because they wanted more of that money to stay in the universities. But I think there is a growing consensus that expanding the system, you need to differentiate it. And from the purpose of having increasing access to low-income kids, I think that makes a lot of sense.
I want to get one more question in, but does anybody else have a quick response on this as well?
No, just to give sort of the opposite perspective. In our country, technical education is important in terms of enrollment, but unfortunately I would say it's still very much like a tracking system where students decide very early on whether they want to go through the technical route or undergo a more sort of university-oriented curriculum. So differentiation starts very early, probably in 10th grade. And we have about 50% of our high school enrollment in technical track. So it's important in numbers, but I think it's still very much undervalued.
So let's get one more question in. There was somebody over here who's been trying to get in.
Just a second.
Just wait a minute. The microphone is coming towards you.
Coming right along.
Anne McLachlan, Center for Studies in Higher Education here in Berkeley. My issue is about social justice, because many countries have been trying to use education as a means of social mobility.
Can you hold the microphone
up a little higher? And it strikes me that there's been experiments in a great many countries, some of which are very successful, which start indeed at an early age, but work through the whole school trajectory into university. Because free tuition, broadening access without preparation for low-income or minority students or rural Black South Africans, they're just not going to succeed in all probability unless they have been trained and groomed. So my question has to do with the extent to which in your respective countries you actually look at programs potentially here. I would say that the United States has made pretty good progress in some respects in dealing with some of these issues, at least in wealthier states and better provided for schools. So I wonder if you have any comments about comparative international sources of improving the success rate of students once they get into college?
So very quickly, I tend to be very ambitious when it comes to policy. And I've learned you have to really make a distinction between what you want to do in the immediate moment, conjuncturally, and what you have to really think about doing systemically and structurally, and not confuse those two. So, you know, providing special programs at South African universities where and you also have to constantly keep your eye on equity with quality, and in ways that really contribute to intellectual, social, cultural, and economic development. All three simultaneously, not consecutively. Many of our societies want equity first, and then we'll fix the quality. And when you approach that in that way, we have gone from 400,000 students in 1994 to 1 million students in South Africa today. That's been a revolution of the last 20 years. Here's the hard reality, as I will argue tomorrow. Universities in South Africa are a killing field of ambitions, aspirations, of mainly black and working class and rural kids. 60% of our students who get to technical universities in South Africa will never graduate. 50% of students who will get to South African universities will never graduate. That's current statistics. And so the effectiveness of universities, the efficiency of our universities, but more, you know, you talk about violence related to high school students. Can you imagine what happens when 600,000 students come to universities, have this possibility of having a better life, and then we discard them? That perhaps explains the violence of South African society towards women, and so on. Okay. So, you know, I think increasingly we have to start thinking beyond the short term, the 4-year degree that allows students to come in and they graduate pretty successfully, and that's how you combine equity and quality, and what are the systemic and structural interventions that we have to make, you know. And yes, I agree, we have to look around the world to see what has really worked, but always make that distinction of what's worked in the short term as a fix, and what really has to be approached in the long term systemically. And I just want to end up on that, because I really don't think myself that we can have this kind of social justice we're talking about unless we tackle questions of inequality in our societies. It's the elephant in the room. No one wants to talk about inequality in our societies, which are getting worse.
I think we're going to end it there, because I thought that was a great statement of some incredibly important issues that I hope the conference does get at as we talk about the new nationalism. Thank you to this extraordinary panel. Thank you very much.